Greetings, and welcome to my channel. This is Sorcerer Tal. You can also find me on Facebook in the Sorcerers Guild. Today on Sorcerer's Shadow Volume 2, we are going to be speaking about the Law of Aesthetics and the Law of Paradox. Now, as I say in the essay, these two laws become very intertwined when we are working with magic that is operating within the veil or on the material plane. So rather than discussing them separately like we did with the law of perceptions and the law of repetition, we will be discussing them together before continuing on to the next essay in this volume of the Sorcerer's Shadow. So we will talk about the law of aesthetics first, then we will talk about the law of paradox, then we will talk a little bit about how they intertwine, as well as a bit of a conclusion about the entire essay at the end of the video. Okay, so the law of aesthetics states that living is an art form that takes place between life and death. Now, as philosophical as this law sounds, that is not what is important to us here today. If you are interested in the philosophical ramifications of the law of aesthetics, I do have a video on that. It's entitled Escaping the Existential Crisis, and I will leave a link to that here. Okay, so, as I said, living is an art form that takes place between life and death. And what that means for us is that, well, things follow patterns. As I said in the last video about the law of repetition, every time a pattern is repeated, the momentum of its cycle increases. And it is the patterns themselves that we are now concerned about. As I said in the last essay, if you can identify objects or themes and patterns, you can use this to understand how a moment is going to unfold and how to affect those moments. But this is also how we can learn to know what type of spell components to use. For example, because of the law of repetition, there is a lot of momentum to the cycle of rose petals being used in spells involving love, attraction, that sort of thing. Now, obviously, I'm not condoning all love spells. I do have a video on that as well. There is a lot of glamour work and that sort of thing that can be done with rose petals. That is perfectly acceptable, though, and it works very well for those types of things. But that's not the only one. We're going to be talking a lot throughout this series about the idea of matching a form to its concept, or in sympathetic magic, the law of like attracts like. That's why things like puppets need to be as much like their target as possible. The more you can link with the theme and patterns of a person, the more directly you can affect them. Of course, we're going to want DNA links and that sort of things ideally, but what we're linking to, even with those, is the patterns and repetitions of cycles within that person that identify that person as an individual. And that's the main point of all this thing with creating links, is so that we're identifying specifically very well who it is that we are targeting with our work, no matter whether it be benign or malevolent. Okay, so that's the basic idea of the law of aesthetics, is that we need to keep within the themes and patterns of the things that we are working with. And so the law of paradox then is the opposite of that. In the last essay, we stated it as, for every thought, there is an equal and opposite thought. And that holds true on the astral plane and the mental plane. But once we get down to the material plane, well, it pretty much becomes Newton's third law. For every action, there is an equal and opposite reaction. And that means anytime that two patterns come into interaction, anywhere that they don't sync up and become joined, they are going to bounce off of each other and cause chain reactions. And that's where things can get a little, well, wiggly. And so we want to keep things, once again, in close to a pattern as much as we can, unless we're trying to disrupt something. If we are trying to disrupt a pattern, throwing something jarring into someone else, into another person's spell work, especially if we're trying to disrupt the pattern of a spell. Throwing something jarring into it can cause a chain reaction and make interesting things happen. Of course, we're going to talk a little bit later on about stick breakings, and that is a little more effective in breaking someone else's spell work, because you can just break it, and, well, obviously for every action there's an equal and opposite reaction, so that doesn't mean there's no repercussions to just simply breaking spell work, but it's different than sticking something into a pattern that's going to make it go haywire. However, sometimes that is what you want to do. But either way, the law of paradox and understanding how these patterns interact and considering these equations is how we decide to go about what we want to add to a spell, what we want to remove. So we want to keep things on a theme and a pattern. And I did talk about that a lot in Volume 1, but it's still very much here. We want to keep that theme and pattern going, because the more we can keep into that, the more we can keep into the pattern of what we want to do and slowly change it over to the new thing. So if you're trying to alter a pattern and you don't want it to just go haywire, sometimes you can alter it little bits at a time. And often this is when we're going to be using magic that is utilizing the law of repetitions in the sense that I talked about in the first book, in that we're doing a spell that we repeat daily. And each time it moves it a little bit over, and we can add more elements of the new thing that we want to create in the cycle over time. That's why a lot of times with your candle magic, the thing that you're introducing, when you light the candles and say that they're attracted, you have the two things and you bring them just a little bit closer each time. You don't immediately bring them together. Partly because, well, if you did that, what are you going to keep repeating? But also, it really is, you have to work with the momentum and move things a bit at a time to keep the law of paradox at bay and causing too much of a reaction to your own actions. Okay, so like I said, though, we are also going to do a bit of a conclusion on the whole the essay as a whole here at the end. So we started with the law of perceptions. Belief imparts reality. And like I said here, even more than the material plane, that imparts key is important. Now, I do believe there is a base reality that is underneath all of that. I believe it's something unknowable that we can never completely know, because our perceptions are always tainted by, well, our perception, our point of perception. And that's going to be biased. In order to see the base reality, we'd have to be able to see the whole thing all at once, and no one is capable of that. At least not to the degree that they can see the whole thing, the macrocosm and the microcosm, at the same time. If you did see all of it at once, as I discussed in the Laughing Lady video, well, you won't be lucid anymore after that, from what I understand of how that works. But either way, I do think that there is some kind of base reality underneath it all. And belief only imparts upon that, but it's clearly very malleable. And as I said in that video, I'm not saying the impossible isn't possible, but we need to understand that belief does impart reality. And that works on two levels. One, we can push ideas into reality and impart them, and get them to slowly manifest over time through that imparting. But also, our beliefs can cloud our vision of the more shared, or at least the shared reality, and perhaps base reality. So we have to be very careful with our beliefs. Because when our beliefs come up against a shared reality that differs from that, well, as I say in the essay, we could walk right into a wall believing there's a hole in it. So it's very important to remember the imparts part. And the law of repetition, well, there is a caveat there as well, in that the more you repeat something, the more you're going to believe it. Yeah? So, you need to be careful of the law of repetition and how it affects your perceptions, because the more you often you hear something, the more it's going to affect your perceptions of reality. So we want to keep ourselves clear of these things. We want to be aware that belief will affect our perceptions, and we need to be able to perceive the base reality as best we can, so we can perceive the patterns and be able to affect them. Okay, so as I say in the essay, in the end, what all of this really means is that through the proper application of metaphor and understanding theme and plot points within the manifestation of reality, we can use symbols and objects to affect that reality. Anyways, that's going to be it for this episode. Next week we will continue with the next essay in the volume, which I'm actually having a little bit of trouble remembering since the book's right here. I don't want to tell you what it is and then be wrong. So, the mechanics of magic operating within the veil is the one we just did. And the next one is cultural appropriation versus social evolution. And we will be talking about that next time. It's a very important topic, especially when it comes to folk magic, because there's a lot of closed systems, and we need to be respectful of that. But anyways, we will get to that next time. In the meantime, if you haven't subscribed to the channel, please take the opportunity to do so now. Until next time, bright blessings and an interesting fate. This is Ben, Sorcerer Tal.